Ladies and gentlemen, in order to keep the timetable and in order to give you enough time to prepare for the social event tonight, I think we need to start. So you are all very welcome to this session on new technologies and IP rights. An exciting bridge ahead. I have the great pleasure to introduce to you three excellent speakers who are most knowledgeable in their field. First of all, on my right, we have Taina Pihlajarinne, who is a professor at the University of Helsinki, particularly in copyright. She will cover the issue of Internet of Things and IPR. Secondly, we have Professor Dinusha Mendis here, which we are very pleased about because she is really one of the pioneers in 3D printing and intellectual property rights. So very welcome. And finally, we are very glad to see Barbara Diaz-Alaminos here. As you all know, she has worked as the manager of legal affairs of ECTA in Brussels before she moved to Copenhagen to become a PhD candidate. And her specialty is artificial intelligence and copyright. Before we start, let me say just one thing. Usually you have one professor and 10 students or more. Today, which is a little bit unfair, we have one doctoral student and 2 professors. But I'm sure Barbara will manage. So, having said this, Professor Taina Pihlajarinne, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Adjunct Professor Åkerblom, for your nice introduction. It's a great pleasure for me to be here today. IoT is a buzzword today, similarly as three-dimensional printing or artificial intelligence. But it seems that technically it has reached a state of maturity that it is time to start seriously considering its legal dimensions. So what is Internet of Things, the IoT? It is a network of everyday devices and appliances. The devices include computer chips and sensors that can collect and transmit data through the Internet. Examples on devices in this context are smart watches, smart toys, smart home devices, and connected cars. Very often, privacy aspects relating to IoT are under legal discussion, and of course these aspects are of utmost importance, but also problems relating to intellectual property law are arising. Maybe the most relevant intellectual property related question is interoperability. Software is an essential element for the IoT products, and interoperability is a necessity for developing IoT. This is because the idea of IoT lies within internet-connected devices which communicate with each other and with users. A starting point is that each manufacturer has its own interfaces, and users are prevented to transfer data from one device to another. Typically, platforms only allow the interoperability of the devices certified by the manufacturer and open source platforms. This limits the ability of IoT applications to be operated by multiple service providers. In order to ensure interoperability, it is essential to offer interface information for software producers. Interface information offers information about how systems and programs communicate with each other and with other systems and programs. Therefore, interface information enables products to operate with each others. It is explicitly stated in the software directive that ideas and principles which underlie any element of a computer program, including those which underlie its interfaces, are not protected by copyright under the directive. However, while technical information as such cannot be protected, if there are many options to implement an interface specification, the way of implementation may be protectable. The Article 6 of the directive includes an exception on decompilation, or so-called reverse engineering, that enables decompilation for interoperability purposes. When considering this exception in IoT context, one remark is that the directive allows certain acts that are indispensable to obtain information necessary to achieve interoperability of computer program with other programs. So interoperability between two computer programs, is that a problem in IoT context? It is possible that gaining interoperability with embedded software, that is software that controls the device or the data collection on the device, which is therefore software interoperability, is enough in many IoT cases. However, the exception has been criticized as it is still uncertain if it allows decompilation for software-hardware interoperability purposes. This might be problematic in some cases. It seems also that relying too heavily on reverse engineering as a mechanism creating interoperability might not be feasible. Then interoperability in patent context. Since patent documents do not necessarily include detailed information on interfaces, this might also prove as important aspect. The agreement on the Unified Patent Code introduces a decompilation exception with an explicit reference to the Article 6 of the Software Directive. This certainly serves as one tool for tackling problems of interoperability. However, differences between national patent laws can still cause some problems. In addition, other internal patent law mechanisms, such as experimental use restriction, as well as exhaustion principle, might solve some interoperability problems. Moreover, mechanisms based on standardization and competition law are tools for fostering interoperability, as well as increasing use of open software. However, they can solve only some parts of this problem. Brief conclusions on interoperability. It seems that the current legislative mechanisms do not enable sufficient interoperability, which would be necessary for the full development of IoT. There might be a need for legal intervention, where adopting more extensive exceptions or limitations for interoperability purposes might serve as one option. Then, how about database protection? Does it have something to do with IoT? In IoT, devices and sensors create data that is sent either in real time or in patches to the central system, which collects, organizes, and analyzes the data. Databases might be copyrighted if they are original in the sense of author's intellectual creation, whereas the sui generis right protects purely investments. A database means a collection of independent works, data, or other materials arranged in a systematic or methodological way and individually accessible by electronic or other means. An ultimate problem herein is that sui generis protection is aimed for traditional forms of databases or traditional forms of collection of information that are easily accessible and organized in a fixed base. Whereas in many cases of IoT, the value lies with the mass of information, which is not necessarily in the fixed base, as it might be analyzed immediately after it has been produced. It is also possible that the data might not be selected or arranged in the way that the directive demands. An idea of protecting traditional forms of databases is reflected in the detailed requirements set by the directive for a database protected under sui generis right. The Court of Justice has issued several preliminary rulings on database protection. The Court of Justice has stated that independent works refers to the fact that a database consisting of any collections of works, data, or other materials are separable from one another without the value of the contents being affected. A method or system of some sort for the retrieval of each of its materials must be included in the database. By a systematic or methodological way of arrangement and individual accessibility is meant regardless of the fact if the systematic or methodological arrangement is physically apparent or not, that the collection should be contained in the fixed base. It must also include technical means, for instance, electronic processes or other means such as an index, a table of contents, a particular plan or method of classification to allow the retrieval of any independent material that it contains. Whether or not data collected by IoT devices forms a database in the meaning of the directive depends on the case. Such data might be valuable when separated from the device, since the data on, for instance, consumers' choices or ways of using the device could potentially have independent value. However, the requirement on systematic or methodological arrangement and individual accessibility would not be fulfilled if the data is captured and analyzed immediately without using any fixed base as required in the ECJ's practice. The same conclusion can be drawn when the data is not arranged in the way that include a technical means for retrieving any independent material contained in the database. The directive also requires a substantial investment in the obtaining, verification or presentation of the contents of database. In IoT, capturing and collecting data is based on automated means. If an extensive collection of data is formed and the development of collecting mechanism has required large investment, one possible interpretation is that obtaining the contents of a database requires substantial investment as the directive demands. However, the assessment must be made on case-by-case basis. Additionally, it might not be clear who is the creator of the database, if there is involvement by several parties to the actions by which the collection of data is formed. In context of IoT, the problem might be underlined by the fact that the most valuable information might be a combination of data from different sources. According to the directive, the author shall be the natural person or a group of natural persons who created the database. However, the issue of authorship has been partly left to the member states' discretion, since it is stated that the legislation of the member states can designate a legal person as a right holder. In addition, the position of databases created by employers has not been harmonized. In recitals of the directive, it is stated that the maker of a database is a person who takes the initiative and the risk of investing. This excludes, in particular, subcontractors. Defining who is a creator of a database formed by IoT devices might be complicated. The creator would be the one who takes the initiative in obtaining, verifying or presenting the contents of the database and assumes the risk of those activities. The assessment of who made the decision of creating the particular IoT system producing the database and who is economically responsible for development and maintenance of the system must be made on case by case. In the case of several such entities, there might be a case of joint authorship. Due to these very many uncertainties, contractual mechanisms seem to be very important in IoT context. It is possible to conclude a contract which states by whom the data produced by IoT is owned and how the parties are entitled to use it. Additionally, it might be necessary in the future for the Court of Justice to develop its practice on database protection, in particular when IoT is concerned, even though this might lead to fragmentation at some level of database protection. Then some brief remarks on trademarks. In case of interconnected devices, might arise a need to refer to another trademark to announce an interoperability information. Since the trademark directive permits the use of a trademark in order to indicate a purpose of the product or service, this aspect does not seem to include any remarkable problem. The introduction of IoT, however, indicates a rapid move towards a service economy and consequently from traditional product marks to service marks. There might be reputational cost also for a holder of a service mark in the case of, for instance, sensors in an IoT devices that do not work properly. A possible consequence might be that a service mark holder will be forced to take responsibility to a certain degree also for the product trademark. But this is not, however, directly a trademark law issue, but an issue relating to business practice. Then, summing up, there might be a need for a legal intervention with respect to interoperability to ensure a balance between IPRs and technological development. The data issue is more open to be solved by case law and by contractual mechanism. It is evident that IoT will put some pressure on IPRs, while at the same time intellectual property rights will be pressured by many other technological developments as well. I believe that we will hear more on those aspects later in this session. Therefore, there is a risk for continuous fragmentation of the intellectual property law. So, thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Taina, for your interesting talk on IoT. I'm sure everybody in this room will sooner or later be confronted with this technological issue if you not have been it already. I suggest that we'll take the questions after the three lectures, so the floor is yours, Dinusha.
Thank you for the kind introduction. Thank you to the organizer Vector for inviting me. It's a great pleasure. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. So I'm going to speak about 3D printing and implications for IPR, with particular focus on copyright and trademarks. And the basis for my talk today is based on two projects that I've done, one for the UK government and one which was from 2013 to 2015. And the second project started in 2015, which is currently ongoing and was funded by another UK research council, Arts and Humanities Research Council, and this project will come to an end in summer, autumn 2017. So what I'd like to do in the next few minutes is to give you an overview of the two projects and then point out some of the interesting findings we came up with, but also point out some of the questions that we came up in both projects. We seem to have more questions than answers, I have to say, but this is an evolving area, so hopefully in the future we'll have more answers than questions. So first of all, a little bit about the government project. This project was commissioned to a team in Bournemouth, so I led the project, and it was commissioned in 2013, and the project's main aim was to find out about 3D printing and where are we now. So what's happening right now, and whether the UK should legislate or whether something should be done at that point. The UK IPO was very interested in two particular aspects, particularly because there was limited literature, lack of empirical evidence, and the two aspects were, one, from the perspective of the consumer, so really trying to find out what the consumer is doing, like what are they sharing, what are they uploading, downloading, what prices are they paying, and what kind of, are there many online platforms? So that's kind of like what they were really interested in. The second question was more from a business perspective, and this was about the use, adoption, and impact of 3D printing in 3 different sectors, in particular the replacement parts, so automotive as well as domestic, customized goods, and high-value small status goods. So we then produced 3 reports. The first 2 on the first report on the online platforms, the second one on the businesses which I mentioned, and then a third executive summary which brings together all our conclusions, our findings, and recommendations to government. I would say the first 2 are really long. They're about 70 pages or 80 pages each, but our executive summary is a summary and is about 17 pages. And it does capture everything, like the summary of the 2 main reports. So this slide, as I mentioned, when we started off and when the IPO asked the question about platforms, I guess in some ways, if I take you back to 1999, the year that Napster came about, I guess the question was whether there are online platforms that are in the same category. Is it something where people are really engaging, and are they really, the design files, is there a lot of piracy, counterfeiting, these kind of things going on? Are there 10 platforms, 50, hundreds, or more? So when we started our research, we also did not realize how many there would be. We came across at the time, this is between 2013 and 15, it was hundreds, closing upon thousands, and now it's gone well into the thousands. So there were many, many more platforms than what we could have anticipated. But also, as with many online accounts, as with Instagram or any account, not every account is active. So people have opened, there are many platforms, but they're not necessarily all being used in the same way as some others. So these 17, through a quantitative analysis, were the top 17 where there's a lot of activity, where people are constantly uploading design files, downloading, sharing, buying, selling, everything. So these are the top 17. If you are in this field and you've been following 3D printing, you might recognize some of these platforms like Shapeways, Thingiverse, they're very famous, but some others maybe not, you may not have heard. But I can say these are the top 17. So this is a very busy slide. I know it's like probably hard for you to take everything on the slide, and I'm not expecting you to either. But one of the 2 things I want to kind of highlight, on the left-hand side, there's one saying categories and brands. So if you look at what the categories are, you'll see there's, I don't know if you can read, but it says miniature art, jewelry design, household, gadget, games. So all quite small items, and this is something that we came across quite often. And whilst the media, if you read any media like BBC or anything, it kind of makes you think that we can all 3D print things in our homes. I mean, we are not there quite yet. The technology has moved on quite a lot, but it is still not possible to press a button and out comes a 3D printer product. It's not that easy. We are moving very quickly towards that, and of course 3D printing has been around for a very long time. The first patent was actually in the 1970s, although the first patent that led to a commercial 3D printer was in 1988. So it's quite a while, but the reason why everyone's talking about it right now is because once those patents expired, then there were those people in the wings waiting to get into the mass market. But we haven't still come to the point where there's like a Steve Jobs or a Bill Gates, where it made it so easy for the consumer market. So categories are still small, as you can see, and of course the brands as well. And this is quite interesting. You can see Apple there, Universal, iPhone, Lego, so big brands. And when we were doing analysis, we could see there are a lot of Disney characters. I mean, when I say a lot, there are things that are like bubbling in the background. So there was like Iron Man, there's like some other characters that are on these platforms. And when I say iPhone, it's not the iPhone itself, it's accessories for the iPhone that people are printing, designing, and really engaging in. And the same with Lego as well. So Lego parts are very, very, seem to be something that is very popular amongst this community. So these things are appearing, and of course that is clearly a concern. But the question was whether, are we at this kind of a Napster moment right now? And was there mass, was the piracy and counterfeiting a mass phenomenon? And our research pointed to the fact that there are issues, but it is not a mass phenomenon yet. So, and this was in 2015. So for that, based on that, we recommended to the government that they should adopt a wait-and-see approach. Now, when we recommended wait and see, we did not mean that you should just sit back and forget about it, but it's more on the side of, one, it's really important to understand the technology, and also when you legislate, it's really important as well that it's not so technology specific, because that can only lead to problems in the future. So technology neutral law is clearly important, but also the technology, even though it's come a long way, it is still, I would say, still in its early days or its kind of infancy. So we did not think from the research that the results that we got, that there's a need to go for it just now. We also felt that at this stage, over-hasty legislation could stifle creativity, and also it'd be prudent to take steps to cultivate a climate better suited to tackling impending IP issues. So that was what we recommended to the government, but at the same time, like I mentioned just a few minutes ago, there are issues that are ongoing. So one of the things that was during the project was an issue that came up with Pokemon. Some Pokemon files appeared on these online platforms without the consent of the company, and that was a big issue, and you can see Pokemon took issue with the platform. Since we finished the project, and I think it was 1.5 years ago, there was this issue with Katy Perry. I don't know whether, I suppose you all know, hopefully you all know Katy Perry, but whether you know about this issue which came up whereby during the Super Bowl in the US, during the break of the Super Bowl, Katy Perry was entertaining the crowds by singing and dancing with these two sharks. And one called the left shark became quite popular because Katy Perry was also, she was trying to trademark the sharks Katy Perry as like a, for products, for various brands. So this was obviously a trademark issue. But what happened was that a guy called Fernando Sosa got the file, and then he 3D printed it, and he started selling the left shark, which is on the bottom of the screen, for about $25. And many people at Super Bowl bought the shark, and also not just at Super Bowl, but went on to buy even afterwards. The lawyers for Katy Perry were unhappy about this, and they took action against Fernando Sosa. It so happens that I do know Fernando Sosa, and so I have had conversations with him, and the latest conversation was that they have come to an amicable deal. So there was this thing of back and forth with cease and desist letters, and then the latest was we come to an amicable deal. But if you go to, he's got a website called Political Sculptor. I should warn and say that he's an artist, so some of the content might seem a little bit controversial, but if you go to his website, you can hear a lot, or you can read about this case that's happened. And but interestingly, he also says this: you can resume buying my left shark at my Etsy shop, or you can buy the rest of my work at my Shapeways shop. So initially, it was being sold through the Shapeways, which is a very famous 3D printing online platform. That's where it was sold from. Of course, after this issue went ahead, it was taken from Shapeways and then was put on Etsy. But even this morning, I was trying to go on Etsy to see whether you can get the left shark, and you cannot. So I believe this issue is still ongoing. So what you can see is that it is very much an area where there's no law. So it's quite hard. And of course, Katy Perry and the left shark, and they are also trying to trademark it. But on this, and she has actually she hasn't been granted the trademark. So, but on the 3D printing scenario where he's taken the file and 3D printed, he's not been allowed to distribute it either. Okay, so this is the most recent one. This happened at the end of last year, and this is another case where it's not necessary to do with 3D printing, but because the case touched on the clarification of 3D printed objects that combine utilitarian and artistic elements in complex ways, it captured the imagination of 3D printing companies, and 3 companies produced an amicus brief for the US Supreme Court, and it's quite an interesting case which kind of tries to clarify some of these issues that have come up in this space. So what you can see is that in terms of the research, and when we're looking at online platforms, and as I said, there's not like a massive amount of piracy and counterfeiting, but issues are still there. So we suggested a wait and see, but at the same time, with all these issues that are bubbling up, probably the best thing that we thought at the time was to establish a working group to assess individual IP rights in light of 3D printing, and not just 3D printing, but also 3D scanning. And this is something I want to do in the next part of my talk. And of course, this could be led by either UK IPO or another group. And this is something that is now the IPO has taken forward. And as of 2017, there's a second project that is taking forward some of the recommendations we made in 2015. So they're really kind of trying to keep up with this technology and what it means for IP. So the second project that I mentioned, if I can go through quickly, is this project called Going for Gold. It is with jewelry. It looks at IP and licensing issues, quite a lot on copyright, surrounding scanning, printing, and mass customization of jewelry in cultural as well as business sectors. So we work with museums like British Museum, V&A, and other smaller museums as well. And we work with businesses that specialize in 3D printing of jewelry. And the idea is to provide practice guidelines for key stakeholders. So a quick word about who I'm working with. So it's led by Bournemouth University and the Center for Intellectual Property Policy and Management. And I work with a company called Museotechnici that specializes in digitizing cultural heritage. And a second company called Euphomia, where amongst other things, they specialize in mass customizing jewelry. So again, why jewelry? Of all the things that we can look at, why did we decide to look at jewelry? This goes back to the UK IPO project. When we were doing that project, something that came up again and again, and as you saw also from categories, there are very small things that we saw like art, jewelry, miniature, gadgets, games, and this is something that came up over and over again. The potential of 3D printing lies maybe not in the final 3D printed product, but in its mass customization of smaller products. So that is where, for example, and at the end of the day, 3D printing is another manufacturing method. And right now, if you want to mass customize your ring through traditional manufacturing, it can be very expensive, but 3D printing opens the door to mass customizing and personalizing these products and the smaller products. So this is the reason why it seemed like a natural progression for us in going towards our second project to focus on jewelry. So when we sought funding from the AHRC, we decided to go with this concept of jewelry. So two key findings from this project. One is what's on the screen. A 3D printer without an attached computer and good design file is as useless as an iPod without music. I've been using the word 3D printing a lot and also scanning, but I think the main point to make here is that that is the last step. The first step is, of course, a good design file. It's a bit like, I guess, our 2D printers and Microsoft Word or PowerPoint or whatever it is. If you don't have anything to print, then the printer is completely useless. And so with 3D printing too. So the hardware is important, and of course, when we also think of 3D printing, we maybe think about patterns, and of course that really comes into play with hardware, but you cannot forget that the software plays a massive role in this context. And so this kind of, for example, so I'm not sure whether you've all seen CAD files or had the opportunity to work with that, but that's kind of an example of a CAD file. But what's really interesting is that if you look at this file, we can all agree that when we think of software, for example, there's no question that there's copyright in the software that's written. But then all of that you see on the screen, that can be seen as functional, right? So like there cannot be, or there is no copyright in that. But the model itself can carry artistic copyright, maybe there's design, and of course ultimately there can be a trademark. But like I said as well, it is the mass customization that really does have the potential. So this is a jeweler who works with customizing his jewelry for the consumers. And on the right-hand side, you can see like a tree forming. And if I go to the next slide, I've kind of put a red box around it. So that is really, for me, it's really interesting, and this research project came up a lot from the designers. What about that? And that is where the customization options are given. And if I go to the next slide, this is a very small caption, and I've kind of blurred it for obvious reasons, but this is the start of a mass customization tree that goes on for a very, it's almost like writing an article. So if you can imagine, this is a lot of work from the designer, and his question was, can I actually protect that? But then is that seen as functional, or can it be seen as a small computer program within a larger computer program? I don't know, that's a question. It's not an answer, and I'm not sure that I have the answer, but it is something that came up, and I think it's an interesting question to further explore in future work. And the second question to complete, because I think I'm running out of time. Yep. Okay, so this is, I'm going to skip these slides because I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go to the second question, which is 3D scanning, but it's a manual or creative task. And very quickly, maybe I'll show you 3 examples. So one is a small scanner, small item, press a button. You can use kind of the apps like this to change the model, and then what you get is on the top right-hand corner, the 3D scanned item. On the bottom, using those apps that I showed in the previous slide, you can add a hat, you can multiply, or you can change the beard. Suddenly the product's been scanned and transformed. Can it be a new work, or is it infringement? What is the position there? This is the original and the 3D scanned and 3D printed item. The reason it's in white is because it's of the support material. The second example is, that's a thinner version of me. It's gone back now. But yeah, so that was a couple of years ago. And that's really easy. I step onto a platform, the scanners go around me, and suddenly I see a file of myself, and then it's like I can see myself getting 3D printed from the feet up to the top. So again, there's a lot of, what I'm trying to say is there personal touch? Is there skill, labor, effort, and judgment from a UK perspective? Or is it just like a manual task? The third one is this project here, which we were doing, the Going for Gold. And this is my colleague who's like spending a lot of time over 2 days scanning a piece of jewelry in that position. A lot of, I would say, a lot of skill there, at least watching him. And this is so this is the piece of jewelry, another piece of jewelry he was scanning. This is like the black glue that you get when you scan. After a while, he says that there's a moving part in the jewelry. He's got to start all over again. So he puts that blue piece underneath it to start the process again. And finally, you have a nice, clean, scanned item. Okay, so 3 examples. The little object, me, and my colleague doing the scanning. So is it a creative or manual task? Since I'm running out of time, I'm going to skip through this, but just to say from a UK perspective, of course, we have our skill, labor, effort, and judgment that's under pressure. But from an EU perspective, what we're looking at is this author's own intellectual creation? So like these are the cases, for example, Infopack, Painter, Football Dataco, these ask this question. And there are some kind of cases also to support it, but also you can argue it both ways. What is the intention? Is it the intention to copy? Or for example, is your intention to restore something? Like for example, in this case here, where 67 fragments of an ancient Dead Sea Scroll were put together. And in that case, it was held that it was not a faithful reproduction, but it's an original copyright work. And in the same way as well, like a photograph in this next slide was held that a photograph of a single static item was an original artistic work because it could be said that the positioning of the object, the angle at which it was taken, the lighting and the focus were all matters for personal judgment, even at a basic level. So you may be able to argue either way. But, in drawing some conclusions, as the technology improves, the debate, I think, will become less of an issue. At the moment, it might be seen as a manual task because the technology is still improving, but of course this can become less so as we move forward, and of course our next speaker is going to tell us about AI, and I think that's a great example of that. We have seen with other technologies like photocopying where you just press the button, and maybe at the time the thought of that, they probably couldn't have imagined it in the 1960s, but now, that you don't even think about doing that, and of course it is clearly a manual task. So even in scanning, this could be the situation. The reason why I bring it up is because the question was asked over and over again in our project by various key stakeholders, and that was something really interesting for us. And finally, we were looking at whether the current IP framework can deal with it, or with, for example, whether we need a sui generis right. But I think ultimately it would be a case that we will have which might clarify these issues for us. So I've really had to stop now, but there are some papers I've written on these topics. So if you have any questions or want to get in touch, then feel free to email me. Thank you.
Thank you, Dinusha, for sharing your deep knowledge on the subject with all of us. Very interesting. Now then, Barbara, the floor is yours.
Presentation? No? I will just start by saying thank you, Max, for the introduction before this very nice panel. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you had enough coffee to not fall asleep in the last session. And my name is Barbara. I'm going to talk about artificial intelligence and intellectual property rights. Now, an overview of what we're going to say, and first of all, I want to make you all aware that you will have a lot of questions by the end of this presentation. I'm going to put out there a lot of questions. We will not see many solutions. I will first try to introduce what's artificial intelligence. Then I want to explain briefly how we apply IP to the AI, how we apply intellectual property to the works of the artificial intelligence from a copyright and from patent perspective, and I will briefly mention trademarks. Now, what's artificial intelligence? Actually, there is no official definition of what's artificial intelligence. There are many different proposals. So I've chosen two today. The first one is what we could consider the first time when artificial intelligence was defined. This was in 1955 in the Dartmouth project. And here, John McCarthy, who's considered one of the fathers of artificial intelligence, defined AI as a problem, that of making a machine behave in ways that would be called intelligent if a human was so behaving. Now, as I said, there is no single definition, and the second one is, second definition I've chosen, it's actually how I understand it. And this is the ability of a device, a machine, artificial intelligence, call it as you want, to perform a function that if performed by any of you sitting down here, we would think it requires the use of intelligence, of human intelligence. Now, important not to confuse what's a robot with what's artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence, to put it in a simple way, is the brains. The robot is the embodiment. And also, not to confuse it with what's machine learning. Machine learning is, of course, an element of artificial intelligence, but this is the way that the artificial intelligence is actually learning. So these are different concepts that we should not mix, even though if they can, of course, come together. Now, to put on an example of this brains idea and embodiment, here we have a camera. The camera takes a picture that's a bit grayish. And when artificial intelligence comes into the picture comes to be professional. So we see here a difference of embodiment, artificial intelligence. Now we have also different levels of artificial intelligence. And this I wanted to mention it because many times I have people come in and say, but artificial intelligence doesn't exist. What are you talking about? This is not a problem. It does exist. There are different levels. Today we have weak artificial intelligence. This is the artificial intelligence that can perform one function, one specific function, even better than we would do. And there is strong and super artificial intelligence. Strong artificial intelligence, it's the artificial intelligence everybody's talking about, that's supposed to come eventually, and is the one that will perform functions as we do, everything we do. And super, it will be the AI that will be better than we are. Now, what are the expectations? Because now we're talking about weak artificial intelligence. So if we look into the investment of very big companies like Google, IBM, if we look into the development of machine learning, of computers, more and more data available there, we were just seeing Internet of Things as well, we would say that AI will keep on developing actually quite a rapid pace. Now, problems within artificial intelligence. Why is this a problem? And I'm sure you've all heard already about liability, who's responsible for a damage when artificial intelligence is involved. You've heard of data protection, what happens when artificial intelligence for learning actually uses a big amount of data. So what if it uses data that's property of someone without asking for permission? Ethical principles as well. How do we teach artificial intelligence to actually behave properly? Education and employment, what's going to happen to paralegal now that we have very nice AI tools to actually do, like for instance, basic research? What's going to happen to researchers, to jobs out there? But most important, at least for me, and what we are to talk about today here, is intellectual property rights. Simple gets complicated. And you've all heard many questions about IP. So simple questions like who's the author of a painting, it's going to get complicated when artificial intelligence is involved because it's going to be hard to define anything. And we have two different ways of looking into AI and IP. We can think of, as I said at the beginning, the application of intellectual property rights to the artificial intelligence, to the device, or the application of intellectual property rights to the AI works. Now, I'm going to start by application of IP to the device. Very briefly, we have a new machine. It can be considered an invention. We decide to apply for a patent. We can have maybe a database as well because we use a big amount of data to teach this device. So if we create a specific database, maybe we can also have protection. Software could also be protected. And design, so the embodiment, might also be protected. All of these, if of course requirements are fulfilled. Now up to here we can have the general issues that you would have as any IP lawyer, but it gets way more complicated when actually we start looking into the works of the artificial intelligence. And here I'm going to look into, as I said, copyrights and patents, and I'll start with copyrights. So now, why is artificial intelligence a problem for copyright? So as I mentioned before, those brains, that artificial intelligence, what if those brains actually would create a work that if created by any of you, it would be actually protected by copyright? And what happens is that when we look into case law, when we look into legislation, they mention all the time human creator, human creativity, human author. So what happens with artificial intelligence? Now, not only what happens with artificial intelligence when artificial intelligence creates fully on its own a work, but also together with someone. And here I put this example. Aaron, this is a computer program that many of you might have heard of already. And the creator of the program thought that he was actually creating together with the computer. He said, I consider myself a co-author and not just an artificial intelligence device to which I give instructions. So what I'm trying to say here is that within copyrights and artificial intelligence, we can have different levels of intervention. We can think of human working on its own completely, human working together with the artificial intelligence, or artificial intelligence working fully on its own. When we look into the first half, we could say, all right, there might not be so many questions, so many problems. Artificial intelligence can be considered as a tool. But when we look into the second half, it gets way more complicated because here, artificial intelligence is getting very involved as much as the person or even more as, than the human. So here is where we have many, many questions. Now, before keeping on talking of the problems and the questions, I want to mention this draft report, and is that in February this year, there was a draft report approved in plenary in the European Parliament, and they're already proposing actually to create civil law rules on robotics. So there might be some developments here, and I will mention it later on as well, because they actually talk as well about copyrights. Now, second, computer-generated works. And there might be some British lawyers here, and you might be thinking, well, why not apply this type of rule? So computer-generated works are protected in the UK, and they consider that the author is the person responsible for the arrangements for this work to happen. But, in my opinion, at least at the moment, I think we cannot really apply this to artificial intelligence works. I don't think the legislator had in mind this type of works when they created it, and also it's a different type of work. The artificial intelligence learns on its own, creates ideas, so it's not the same as just giving some directions to obtain a specific solution. Now, coming back to the red zone, we have two different types of issues within AI and copyright. We can talk about upstream issues and downstream issues. Upstream issues are the issues that come up from feeding the artificial intelligence. So it needs a lot of information in order to learn and to create something. And downstream issues are the issues that arise from the work of the artificial intelligence. So who's the author, who's the owner of the creation, and so on. And I will focus now on downstream issues. Now, there are many, many questions, as I said before, so I've chosen two questions today. The first one is there any copyright at all? Can we apply rules as we have them now? Actually, when we talk about copyright of works created by artificial intelligence, and I do not have an answer for it, but I think that it might be possible to find an answer by looking into three elements that are somehow related to the requirements for a copyright to be granted. And this is, can artificial intelligence be an author? Can artificial intelligence be creative? And can artificial intelligence actually create a work as any of us would do? If we look into authors, we can say, well, we agree that anybody here in this room can be an author. Better, worse, we can all paint something, and we might get protection for it. If we look into animal-made art, many of you might have heard of this monkey selfie. A monkey take a selfie of himself, then organizations want the monkey to be author and copyright owner. The owner of the camera says no, that he should be the owner, and bad luck for all of them, nobody has a copyright so far. But for the animal, and then I put this example to just not mention a monkey, it's Winnie the Bunny. This bunny is really good at painting, but unfortunately, I think none of them actually will be an author. And then what happens then to artificial intelligence? Should we compare artificial intelligence to animals? Should we compare artificial intelligence to humans? I don't have an answer either. Now, creativity. And this is very interesting because when we think of copyright, we can all agree that there is an element of randomness in the creative process. In the Dartmouth project that I was mentioning at the beginning, where artificial intelligence was defined, they actually thought that any aspect of human behavior could be described so precisely that it could always be replicated by a computer. We also have a test as well to actually know when a computer or a device is being creative. And this is a Lovelace test. If a machine produces something that we did not expect, then it's considered to be creative in a very short way of putting it. So then we could say, all right, so if we think of these two elements, then we can replicate creativity, which is the most sort of important and intrinsically personal part of copyright. But isn't it this something that should rather be linked to the intentionality of creating something? Isn't copyright something more personal? And also I wanted to mention here creative computation, because there are actually projects looking at creativity. There is, for instance, WIM, the What If machine. This is an European project, and it creates storylines and it analyzes whether people actually like them or not. And it's actually relatively old, so it's not such a new topic as we think sometimes. And this one is really interesting, concrete, because it studies creativity from a scientific perspective. And what they try to do is to find a theory to explain the way that the mind works to be creative, to see if indeed then this can be replicated. So if this is the case, as it seems somehow, then machines would be able to proceed the same way we do when we are actually being creative. So maybe it's not so intrinsically human. But still, we will have the question, of course, there. And then the last element was the work. And what I wanted to mention here is that maybe we are actually talking about a different type of work. So maybe tomorrow Sosos here wakes up and he wants to be a singer. And there is a machine on the right side, artificial intelligence, who's also singing, but maybe these are just different type of works. Maybe this is a different pool of works. And here I wanted just to mention also there is some work being done. So as I mentioned before, this draft report, they actually started talking about copyright and elaborating criteria for an own intellectual creation for works produced by computers or robots. What it means exactly, I'm not sure. Finally, this would be the second question. So the first one, it was, so is there any copyright? Can we apply rules as we have them now, the case law, legislation, and so on? And the second question that I would consider it's important, it's ownership. Who's the owner of these works? I put here this example. This is an artificial intelligence creative director of a company, McCann, and this is an advertisement company. As we see here, the author of the idea does not really have to be the owner of the copyright. It could be actually that the author is the machine creating something, but then the owner is a company. And this is a clear example of that. So here, this machine actually gives ideas for creating advertising, but the owner is the company. But when we look into, for instance, what I mentioned before of computer-generated works and these human arrangements, the moment that the artificial intelligence gets very independent, it might not be anymore connected to this human activity. So does it make any sense that in the end we give all the rights to this initial person who invested in this creation? And this is, of course, another open question. So the conclusions is that I have no conclusions, but many questions. And in my opinion, as Max mentioned, I'm actually studying this topic, so I think these questions might be very useful to be answered at the very beginning when we start thinking of copyrights. We will see what happens in a few years. Then, second, I wanted to mention patents. And with patents, the issue is very similar. We actually have machines that are capable of creating inventions. And for instance, this creativity machine, I was reading about it the other day. It was created about 20 years ago, and it created a patent that the creator of a machine registered on its own. But he himself recognized, I did not create this mechanism of actually learning. It was the machine that created it. So here I wanted to mention the European Patent Convention, because I think it could be interesting. I'm keeping in mind here the artificial intelligence as a tool more than just being independent. And we can think of Article 52 and 56. Article 52 regarding discoveries and 56 regarding inventive step can be interesting when talking about AI. Inventive step. So there has to be an inventive step in order for a patent to be granted. And this requirement is fulfilled if the invention is not obvious to a person skilled in the art. And we have already the word person. So how do we get artificial intelligence in the picture? We know that actually, and based on the guidelines of the European Patent Convention, any average skilled person can use the tools that are considered normal in the field of work. So in order to put the artificial intelligence in the picture, we think as the AI as a tool. We don't want the AI to be obvious to this average skilled person. So we could say if the artificial intelligence is normal, it might be obvious to this average skilled person, therefore we would not have a patent. Or we could say if it's not normal, it's not so obvious to the average skilled person, there might be a patent. But still, we don't know what's normal within artificial intelligence. And then discovery, I wanted to mention it because it's also very interesting when we talk of artificial intelligence, as I said before, sometimes it's actually creating something without any human intervention anymore, even though if at the beginning of the line there was some human intervention. So isn't this something maybe that someone discovered? And therefore, as a discovery, we cannot actually grant a patent because there is no practical use. So how do we do to get to a positive result and actually get a patent when they're using artificial intelligence, even if it's as a tool? And conclusions is that even if I was talking as artificial intelligence here as a tool, is that when we get again to the level when the artificial intelligence is creating more than the human, we get to the same questions as in copyright. Who's the author? Who's the inventor in this case? Who can apply for this patent? And lastly, I wanted to mention trademarks because this is ECTA. Here I don't have any questions or problems so far. But I believe artificial intelligence can be very useful to trademarks, especially for counterfeits, programs online that can recognize directly that there are some fake goods out there. And also, I put this picture of a building which represents somehow a company. When we grant trademarks, this can be owned by companies, by businesses. And this gives actually quite a lot of ideas when we think of how do we attribute rights within artificial intelligence, because here we're talking about a company, about an entity. This is not a human either. So a very brief summary, then we saw what's artificial intelligence. We've seen application of intellectual property to the artificial intelligence. We've talked a little bit about copyright, who's the author, who's the owner, many questions. We've talked about patents very briefly and trademarks. And as conclusions, more questions even than before, we might think whether maybe new legislation might be the solution. I'm at this point not so sure because it takes quite a long time and artificial intelligence is really developing, so I don't know if it's the answer. Maybe the answer is actually case law. Maybe it's contract law, actually, contract between everybody who's involved in the process of creating an invention. And then I think it's, as lawyers and legislators, it's important when we talk about AI to keep in mind this too much versus too little protection. Maybe we want to think that there might not be too much protection as to prevent the technology to develop, but not too little either, so that, for instance, authors or any others are not granted or protected as IP owners. So, thank you very much. And if any of you is interested, the slides are on the ECTA application, and I put some readings at the end.
Thank you, Barbara, for a most interesting talk. Before I give the word to the audience, I would like the panel to comment upon one thing. If you listened carefully to Taina, you saw that and you heard that she talked about possible intervention, legal intervention, when it came to interoperability. Dinusha talked about a wait-and-see approach, and Barbara had a lot of questions, problematized the too much and the too little. I will start with you, Taina. How do you feel about technological development and legislation? How to combine these two things?
Thank you. This is very, very interesting question. I think that technical development might cause a danger for continuous fragmentation. And I think that it would be more feasible to try to formulate and find some more general and abstract principles by which the new problems could be tackled instead of implementing continuously like fragmented legislation.
Right, thank you. Dinusha, please.
So a really interesting question, and I believe that law is no stranger to technology. For centuries, we've had technology that has challenged law, so all the way from the printing press to the fax to the TV, photocopying machines. There's always been this kind of a tension between law and technology, and legislation and technology. I'm an optimist, so I believe that, whilst in our project we did say wait and see approach, that is of course to get the best and the optimum and the best law, and for that it's important to understand the technology. If you're legislating around these new technologies like AI or Internet of Things or 3D printing. So I think that is a really important point. But for many years, this has always been this tension, but the law has adapted, and IP law has adapted over many, many years. So I believe that we will see, I think we'll have challenges, but I think the law will adapt, and we will have good laws in the future.
Thank you, Dinusha. Barbara, please.
So in my opinion, as I was saying before, I think when we look into artificial intelligence, the legislation is really not at all adapted. There is some green light in that we saw this draft report from the European Parliament, so hopefully there will be something happening. But at the same time, this technology is developing so fast that I'm not sure the legislative procedure could actually keep at pace with this development. So this is why I had this last question. It might be that we find alternative solutions to be more easy to solve these problems, like contract law or maybe case law. But I'm assuming eventually it will have to keep up to it.
Thank you. Now then, it's your turn. Although I understand that it has been a long day and you're looking forward to the social events, please, there we have one. Could you introduce yourself, Vladen?
Thank you, Max. Congratulations. I'm Vladen Vuk from Croatia. Thank you for this excellent and stimulating session. I have two questions. I have noted all of you referring to piracy or counterfeiting as if these concepts actually survive in digital environment. Because I think that when you analyze what a copy is, they hold only in analog environment. These are analog concepts. So it's a question, what do we do next with this? And probably also possible pointer to, where to look for the answers. The other question is what each one of you thinks about the future of Paris and Bern Convention. How useful are these instruments in the environment at all that we are facing? And I will show you, I can't show to everyone, but here this is where this question came to me. This is human-made. This is computer-aided design, and this is 3D printed artificial intelligence object with the same function. It has a static component, it has all the tenets of the international instrument don't make sense anymore. What do we do now?
Thank you very much. Barbara, would you like to start this time, please?
I think my answer is going to be very similar to the one before. If we look into Paris and Bern Convention, we have the same question. This is legislation that's not updated. On top of that, it's very hard actually when we talk about copyright, which is what I'm actually focusing my research on, it's really hard to find harmonization. So if you think of technology, it gets even more complicated. So I don't have the answer now, but something will have to happen, of course.
All right, Dinusha, please.
So really interesting questions. I'm not sure that I have specific answers for you, but I guess it's true. I mean, you talk to the digitally right, it sounds as if like, as if this has survived piracy, counterfeiting, but it has not. And I mean, I guess the difficulty is that technology crosses jurisdictions, whereas law is, we try at harmonization, but ultimately, it is ultimately very relevant to each jurisdiction, each jurisdiction. So taking your questions together, Paris, the relevance of Paris and Bern, I mean, I don't know. I mean, this is where I think, these technologies are really pushing the boundaries of the laws we have. As I said before, I think the laws can adapt, but it is still a challenge. And of course, whether I mean, even in the context of, I read an article where someone was putting forward, the next step has got to be kind of an international code on these kind of technologies. But we've already tried this, and harmonization doesn't come easy to us. But maybe there's something we should strive for. I'm not sure that I've answered your question satisfactorily, but it's a great question, and something we should all think about.
Thank you. Taina?
Thank you. It's a very, very difficult question. I think that in copyright, the focus is too often in concepts that are functional and technical, like reproduction and communication to the public, and they are not very easy to adapt into new environment. And I'm not sure how long can for instance, concept such as reproduction survive, or should it be should we adopt some other tools instead of reproduction or concept of reproduction? And it is true that the big conventions are not indeed very flexible instrument. They are really hard to change, and I think that maybe one option would be adapt more extensively or implement or develop soft law mechanisms. It would be easy to react with those instruments.
Thank you. More questions? We have one over there, please.
Thank you. This is for Barbara. I'm Martin Michal from Mexico. In your presentation, you mentioned about this article that appears in The Economist. And if I correctly understand when I read it, it says that possible conclusion is that the artificial intelligence has to be educated as a human. And if that's how, in your opinion, I know we don't expect answers now, how will it have an influence to consider an author or not, or has any influence about the originality, the creativity, considering that, according to the article, of course, it's just research, has to be educated in the same similar method as a human is educated.
Right, Barbara.
I think to answer this question, we will have to get very much into what's actually the artificial intelligence, which might be very complicated as well. As I see it, because the artificial intelligence learns on its own, indeed it can learn as a human, because we all actually read a lot of books to learn what we learn. We raise with our family, and this is how we develop and the way we are. Well, then it could be that the AI indeed can be creative, but we should not forget that these are still machines, not humans, and the law so far is done for humans, not for what we create. So, but this is of course a very personal opinion. I'm happy to discuss later on if you want. Thank you.
All right, thank you. We have room for one more question. If there are none, I do thank our speakers for excellent lectures and sharing the information with us. Before I close, I would like to ask Ruta or Sosos, do you have any housekeeping issues? Sosos, please.
Yes, thank you, Max. Maybe a couple of housekeeping announcements. First one is that buses will be leaving, I think, at 6:45 for the event tonight. And they will still be going until 7:20, because it takes, I think, about 45 minutes to reach the venue of tonight's event. Hopefully it will not be raining, so we'll have some nice horse show. The other thing I want to tell you is to use the app, because actually if you had used it, you wouldn't need me to be here making these announcements, for example. So it's a very good app, well designed and very helpful. Thank you, Max.
I wish you all a nice evening.